My name is John Shenot, and I'm an associate on the U.S. team of the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I'm speaking to you from my office in Colorado. We're excited to see so many people attending the webinar for what I think will be an informative and timely discussion. Today's topic, the topic at hand, is preparing for EPA regulations, and I'd say it's a hot topic, and there's a lot of ground to cover. Before we get started, I'm going to say a few words about logistics. During this webinar, everybody's lines will be muted in order to prevent disruptions and call waiting sounds and preserve sound quality. If you have questions during the webinar, what you need to do is type them into the chat box, which is in the GoToWebinar window on the right side of your screen. And there's a little orange or red icon with an arrow in it that can open and close that window. So if you need to type a question and the window isn't open, click on the orange arrow and type into the chat box where it says type message here. We'll be monitoring those questions, and then I'll relay them to the presenters. My plan is to hold all the questions until after both presentations are complete, unless I see one that warrants interrupting our speakers. And I think that about covers the logistics. All that's left is to introduce today's presenters. Dave Farnsworth is a senior associate on RAP's U.S. team, and he works out of our Vermont office. He's been with RAP about 5 years, and prior to coming to RAP, he served as a hearing officer and staff attorney for the Vermont Public Service Board. Dave is the lead author of both the original RAP publication that was titled Preparing for EPA Regulations and an update to that publication that he'll tell us about today. Ken Colburn is also senior associate on RAP's U.S. team. He joined us in 2011 and hails from New Hampshire. Ken has previously served as the top air pollution regulator in New Hampshire and is the executive director of NESCOM, which is a coalition of air pollution agencies in 8 northeastern states. Ken will be providing us with an update on EPA's greenhouse gas regulations for power plants. I think we have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get started. Our first presenter is Dave Farnsworth, and Dave, the podium is all yours.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. It's just great to be here. So as John mentioned, we're taking a very, very quick tour through 5 EPA regulations developed under the Clean Water Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and the Clean Air Act. That's going to be my slice of this, and then we will alight, slow down a bit, and you can take your running shoes off, and Ken will be talking about new source performance standards for greenhouse gases and how they might how that might affect the power sector. And Ken's going to be pushing these slides, so let's go ahead, Ken. So John mentioned also, RAP's following up on a 2011 report on effects on the electric industry of pending EPA public health and environmental regulations. The current report provides regulators with help in identifying significant trends, related issues, broad evaluation of options available to utilities for compliance, and where relevant, an understanding of scheduling and timing issues. It's important to recognize that this report does not provide the latest numbers on compliance options or costs. It's not going to provide any silver bullets, quick answers. What I wanted to do is emphasize our suggestions are meant to be considered and then tailored to your specific regulatory context. So today, we push very quickly through a handful of these rules to give you a very, very general sense of them, but encourage you to delve into greater detail into the paper that's going to be coming out in the next several weeks. Slide, Ken. So the way we look at this is that the ability of energy regulators to be responsive to the challenges of these health and environmental regulations is being tested. And by that we mean that regulators, they work to achieve traditional regulatory goals like reliability and resource adequacy and just and reasonable rates. And these goals have resulted in a strong energy system. I think they've served us really well. But today energy regulators need to work with environmental regulators and utilities to ensure thorough planning, and through planning and assessing utility preparedness to assure the attainment of both these traditional goals that I just listed and affordable environmental compliance. And so that's how we see the challenge facing energy regulators today. So what I'm going to do, as I mentioned, is go through 5 rules very quickly. They're not going to be pretty segues here, folks, but I just want to give you a snapshot of what the rule is seeking to do, how it might go about doing it, some of the issues at play within the rules, and where relevant, some of the timing issues that should be significant to you. So let's start with the 316B rule next. This is about cooling water intake structures. And this cooling water rule is designed to address the problem of impingement and entrainment of fish and other organisms. The withdrawal of cooling water by facilities removes billions of aquatic organisms from waterways each year, including fish, crustaceans, shellfish, marine mammals, other aquatic life. Most impacts are to early life stages of these organisms. These organisms die because they're either unable to swim away from water intakes and are impinged against an intake screen, or they pass through the screen and they become entrained in the cooling system. The rule applies to existing sources, and these sources that are withdrawing 2 million gallons or more a day and are using 25% or more of that water exclusively for cooling. Prior to the government shutdown, this rule was supposed to be issued this month, and I apologize for not having any newer information on that, but the final rule is imminent for this. Impingement standards are set as either monthly or annual average mortality rates, or they're an adjustment of intake velocity. And for entrainment standards, permit writers, because you should remember that this goes into a water permit, National Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System permits, NPDES permits, and the permit writers will be relying heavily on site-specific factors that they put together the permit for purposes of entrainment standards. Next slide, Kim. Compliance under this rule, as you can see, a facility has to demonstrate that it either meets these average mortality rates or through-screen velocity of a ½ foot per second. For entrainment, as I mentioned, this is going to be based largely on the permit writer's best professional judgment. And just standing back a second, making several observations here, there are a couple of uncertainties that are likely to be in play as this goes forward. And one of those I would think would be associated with the permit writer's approach. On the one hand, you're going to see NGOs who are not going to be, very likely not going to be satisfied in certain cases with the thoroughness of the studies that go into a permit. Companies very likely are going to be have concerns about the cost of these studies. There are a couple of risk arguments that energy regulators are likely to encounter with respect to this rule. One of them is a pretty standard sort of argument. It goes something like this: compliance is too costly. Plants that have to comply with these expensive fixes won't be able to operate economically. Plants will shut down, and this will affect resource adequacy. There's another counter-argument that is likely to come up and that regulators should expect to hear, and it goes something like this: water-dependent cooling under conditions of limited access to water or limited availability of water could result in plant closures or derates, affecting supply and resource adequacy. So those are two sort of points of view I think that one could expect to see as this rule is implemented. Let's move from cooling water to effluent limitation guidelines. EPA has developed these guidelines because over half of the toxic water pollution in the United States comes from power plants. Note, the term guidelines is a misnomer. These are enforceable rules. They should be finalized in May of next year, in 2014. They apply to direct and indirect dischargers. Next slide, Ken. This figure from EPA can give you a sense of some of the points in of a power plant that are at issue here. There are numerous liquid waste streams that can come from a fossil plant. They include bottom ash, fly ash, mercury controls, flue gas, desulfurization waste. And they can go straight into the water, or they can go into publicly owned treatment works, municipal treatment works. And thus the distinction that you'll see in the Clean Water Act regulations with respect to direct and indirect discharges. Next, Ken. So EPA, under its authority, Clean Water Act authority, regulates 3 categories of pollutants: conventional pollutants like oil, grease, toxic pollutants, and non-conventional pollutants. Here we're focused on toxic pollutants. And that's broken down into 2 categories: metals like arsenic, mercury, selenium, and toxic organic pollutants like benzene, phenol. While we can't go into detail here, the focus here is on limits set with the best available technologies for removing these types of pollutants, toxic pollutants from waste streams. And EPA has indicated its inclination towards 4 of these approaches, which are shown in this figure. Moving right along, let's talk about coal combustion residuals now. Okay, so coal combustion residuals are byproducts of power plant coal combustion, like ash and flue gas desulfurization waste. Ken, if you could just go backwards 2 slides, let's take a look at that figure once again. Note here the landfill and ash pond leachate. These are the examples of coal combustion residuals that the rule envisions. You can return to that slide, Ken. The poster child, if you want to think of it that way, example for this is a spill that occurred in 2008 in TVA's Kingston, Tennessee fossil plant. There are over 1 billion gallons of coal, fly ash, slurry that were released from an 84-acre containment area when an earth wall was broken. How to deal with these sorts of materials is the focus of this rule. EPA has proposed this rule several years ago, and it's been, from the perspective of a lot of folks, been sort of sitting on the back burner. Most recently, there was a court ruling in a case called Appalachian Voices, where the court ordered EPA to produce a plan and a schedule for this rule by the end of December. So EPA is going to have to produce that according to the Appalachian Voices decision. As I mentioned, this rule is promulgated under EPA's Resource Conservation Recovery Act authority, RCRA authority, and that statute and the regulation is structured, the proposed regulation is structured 2 pretty significantly different ways, basically, which would affect the stringency with which it subjects waste creators, transporters, and storage sites to various requirements, including things like permitting, groundwater monitoring, and financial assurance. Next slide, Ken. You folks can read this at your leisure. This was out in the proposed, this figure was in the proposed rule, but very basically, under subtitle C, if EPA goes that way, it would be regulating coal combustion residuals, CCRs, as hazardous waste, and at a much more stringent level. If it were to go under subtitle D, it would be treating CCRs as non-hazardous waste, as solid waste, and it would be subject to less expensive, less stringent approaches. Now, in the ELG that just came out, EPA was talking about coordinating the effluent limitation guidelines with the CCR rules, because as you notice from looking at that figure, these waste streams, solid or liquid, are connected and the same streams. Next slide, Ken. So EPA is interested in coordinating these 2 rules if possible. Both effluent limitation guidelines and the CCR rules affect the disposal of combustion residuals in surface impoundments of power plants, And EPA needs to be able to ensure the attainment of its statutory responsibilities. Under the Clean Water Act, that's restoring and maintaining water quality in the country. Under RCRA, it's protecting human health and the environment. But EPA has indicated an interest in integrating the two rules, if possible, looking at the design of any final substantive CCR regulatory requirements and timing and implementation of the ELG and CCR rule. There's potential, according to EPA, with respect to the rule, it could reduce or entirely eliminate discharges to surface water, including control or elimination of wastewater going to and discharged from service impoundments. So that's something that EPA is intending to do. Will it be able to do that given the recent court order? I think that's something they will, that we'll just have to stay tuned and see what we see. So we're going to shift gears now and move to the Clean Air Act and talk about the cross-state air pollution rule. The cross-state air pollution rule, known as CSAPR, that was designed to address interstate transport of pollutants that are emitted by electric generators located in the eastern two-thirds of the country. The rule is sort of built around Section 110 of the Clean Air Act. Now that section has to do with state implementation plans. State implementation plans, or SIPs, are basically the collection of the state's air regulations. And the way, there are loads of issues associated with this, but with respect to the cross-state air pollution rule, the idea here is that states do the things they do in their SIPs to ensure compliance with criteria pollutants. And what states have found out recently in this part of the country, the eastern two-thirds of the country, is that despite undertaking efforts as part of their SIPs, they're unable to attain the national ambient air quality standards for some pollutants. And they've found out that it has to do with transported air pollution. EPA promulgated the CSAPR rule. It was challenged and it was vacated, and now it's before the Supreme Court. In the meantime, the CARE rule stays in place, and the CARE rule was the rule that was in place before CSAPR was promulgated. So, part of the story here is that we just sit there and watch and see what the Supreme Court does and what it does with CSAPR. The other part of the story, I think, for regulators is to recognize that there still is air pollution being transported across states. States still have a hard time meeting the requirements in their SIPs, not just because of what they are doing, but because of what's coming over their borders in the way of transported air pollution. And there is one case that suggests that there's even potential liability for specific units despite CSAPR having been vacated and being before the court. Next slide, Ken. There's a case, I believe it's out of the Third Circuit. It's called Shenot, in which the court upheld a rule that imposed emissions limits and compliance schedules on an individual coal-fired plant in Pennsylvania. The Third Circuit disagreed with Shenot's attempt to hold up the Homer City case, which is the case that vacated CSAPR, to hold that case up and say, look, CSAPR has been vacated. We can't be responsible for transported air pollution. The Third Circuit disagreed. The Clean Air Act still requires EPA to ensure that states can put into effect their state implementation plans without significant interference from upwind neighbors. That court, instead of going, that court decision, instead of going to Section 110, recognized that there is an additional section of the Act, Section 126, that allows states to, that contemplates direct regulation, they say, by EPA of specific sources that generate interstate pollution. So, regardless of the outcome of the CSAPR ruling, it's reasonable to expect that generators could be subject to some obligation with respect to their transported pollution. We know that CSAPR is going to, that decision will be decided for the Supreme Court, and EPA is going to have to move forward with some sort of follow-up to CSAPR. With that, let's turn from air transport and talk about air toxics in the MATS rule. So power plants are responsible about half the nation's mercury emissions and half of the acid gases that get put in the atmosphere. The MATS rule, the Mercury Air Toxics rule, sets standards for new and existing sources of hazardous pollutants. And it went into effect in February 2012 and has a 3-year compliance period. So this is a rule that's gone into effect. It has been challenged in a case called White Stallion. The decision from that court is pending, and but the court, I believe, declined to stay the rule. So the rule's going forward. Next slide, Ken. As companies implement this rule, it'll be it's worth noting that there are a number of flexibility provisions I think that are worth considering here. Let's just look at 3 very briefly. Facility-wide emissions averaging is allowed under this rule. In other words, units in the same category within a facility can be averaged, and that makes it less costly and potentially cheaper for compliance entities. The rule allows for the use of surrogates. Let me explain that a little bit. This rule is promulgated under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, which lists over 100 toxic air pollutants. Instead of creating compliance requirements for each of those pollutants that may be associated with the combustion of fossil fuels, what the rule allows for is the use of surrogates. In other words, it allows for example, particulate controls to count for controls of arsenic, nickel, and chromium. Hydrogen chloride controls can count for other gases here, other acid gases. So the logic here is that arsenic, for example, gets into the environment attached to particulate matter, and so the controls of particulate matter can be used to capture the arsenic. Again, it's an approach that simplifies things a bit and makes it a little bit easier to comply with these requirements. The final flexibility point I'd like to bring up here is timelines. As I mentioned, there's a 3-year compliance framework for this rule. There's an additional 1 year for companies that request it beyond that first 3 years. According to a report that was put out in June by NACA, which is the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, there were about 50 applications that have been submitted, and none have been declined. So think of MATS as 3 + 1 year, so 4 years for compliance. You will hear that there's an additional year, 3 + 1 + 1. That additional year comes within the context of an enforcement action. And while arithmetically those add up to 5, that last single year is not particularly attractive. If you're a company and you want your shareholders to stay happy, you don't want to get splashed across the newspaper headlines, you probably don't want to get into an enforcement action to take advantage of that final year. But there is 4 years compliance despite that. So I'm going to take my running shoes off, sit down here, and I'm going to pass this off to Ken. I look forward to your question. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. I guess that means I'll put my my running shoes on, eh? We expect that many of you are already somewhat familiar with EPA's work on carbon pollution standards for new and existing power plants, consistent with the President's directive on June 25th. So I plan to offer a bit of framing and then some discussion about what shape that rule may take and how it might be implemented, and some thoughts on what states should be doing now. In reality, of course, everything awaits decisions that EPA has yet to make. So perhaps the most important thing is to get to your questions. So I'll try to use those running shoes effectively for the next few minutes. In terms of framing, this regulation is an entirely new area of endeavor for EPA. It's doing so with very little, let's say, practice using Section 111, and its prior uses, which are very limited, have also been far more narrow especially with respect to existing sources. So much so that wags in the trade have referred to Section 111 as the 40-year-old virgin, reflecting the fact that the Act, of course, turned 40 this year, last year, whatever. It's also operating on a very tight schedule. The President asked EPA, told EPA to propose a standard in June to finalize it in June 2015. You all are probably aware that EPA has to send its rules for sign-off to OMB on a 90-day ahead window. So in reality, it's got a couple more months here to draft the rule to send to OMB. And of course, there's some legal tension associated with this as well. Given the narrow history of Section 111, there are legitimate legal questions about how broadly it can be interpreted, and as with most anything we've seen from EPA, it's likely to be litigated. In addition, there are several recent SIP-related court decisions that reinforce states' role. So what will come through in the remainder of this presentation, I'm sure, is how prominent states' involvement will be in this effort going forward. The first order of business, of course, was new sources, and the President required EPA to propose a rule there in September. It did so. It used a source-based approach and marginally bifurcated coal versus gas new units with only a slight difference in their proposed requirements. The real action, of course, is the installed base of existing sources, and that's Section 111D. Here, EPA maintains that it has the ability to undertake a system-based approach, which reflects the best system of emission reductions as compelled in the Act, taking into account that that system has to be adequately demonstrated and include consideration of cost and compliance time frame. Here again, as David indicated, it's referred to as an emission guideline, but don't be mistaken that it's optional. This will have the force of law. There's also a third category of modified or reconstructed sources. It's not clear how that would be treated. There's a reason to think in terms of both of the other options. I lean toward the existing source interpretation, but we'll see. Also, in terms of what form the rule's apt to take, we anticipate that the best system of emission reductions are likely to represent some combination of supply-side and demand-side approaches. On the supply side, of course, there's at-the-site improvements, heat rate improvements, fuel switching, co-firing biomass, things of that nature, and measures that are closely related to and tied to the sector itself, dispatch or renewable portfolio standards, or even some kind of fleet averaging would be possible. On the demand side, there's energy efficiency, again, both at the site or off the site. Perhaps energy efficiency resource standards might apply here, or even utility demand side management programs. Combined heat and power might be another opportunity under the rule. But a lot of cornerstone questions remain. Specifically, for example, what's the target going to be? What level of reduction will be required? And then compared to what? Compared to what baseline of performance? What year of emissions, for example? And then, of course, within what compliance time frame? One commonly noted suggestion is the President's commitment in Copenhagen in 2009, which is 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. That was an economy-wide measure, so it might have different ramifications if that were implemented in the power sector alone. However, recall that the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 were nearly 20 years ahead of this pronouncement, so it may not jive with the Act, and I don't think that, though I don't have a better suggestion at the moment, I don't think the two need be connected. Equally uncharted is the whole how question. How will this be implemented? We're not clear, of course, at this point, but as I indicated, it's very likely that states will get first crack. The Act says that each state will submit a plan, and then specifically references that those plans would be similar to Section 110 criteria pollutants SIPs. They are known in the trade as state equivalency plans, and they will be due nominally in June 2016, a year after the rule goes final, which itself is a pretty aggressive schedule. There are a number of cornerstone questions here as well, particularly how state equivalency plans will be approved, what they will hinge on, specifically such things as how emission reductions will be measured. Will it be a rate-based approach, pounds per megawatt hour, or a mass-based approach, tons of CO2 equivalent? Perhaps a state budget of mass, how many tons can be emitted in the state, a cap effectively. Other approaches could be carbon intensity or carbon pricing. Depends on, I expect it will largely depend on what approaches states want to take and justify to EPA. Further, of course, are questions associated with how will carbon emissions be accounted for, tracked, and reported to EPA, and one might hope that EPA would provide a model rule. Given the schedule that EPA faces, I certainly wouldn't bank on seeing a model rule. Implementation issues also have questions associated with what flexibility mechanisms, if any, might be provided. Will off-site energy efficiency be allowed a role? Will there be any kind of trading? In other programs, renewable portfolio standards, for example, there are often alternative compliance payments. So these are all questions as well. Quantifying the emissions benefits of efficiency, if it is allowed to play, is another whole issue. What about emissions evaluation, measurement, and verification? Might there be deemed emission reductions like there are often in states deemed energy savings? There are in associated with non-attainment areas and air policy generally location issues as well. Your energy efficiency may actually back off a plant in a different state, so whose compliance is that? And then there's the traditional stipulation in the Act that emission reductions be real surplus, verifiable, permanent, and enforceable. And finally, the question is, will EPA provide much in the way of guidance on this at all, or just leave these issues to the state in its state equivalency plan proposal? I would note that our moderator, John Shenot, recently compiled a paper specifically on this topic, quantifying emissions from energy efficiency. That's available on the RAP website for those of you who might be interested. Finally, there's the question of how will first mover states be recognized. There are 9 or 10 states associated with RGGI. California's done AB 32, an aggressive program there. There's the Western Climate Initiative. Many states have renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency standards. Some have incorporated carbon in their integrated resource planning. So those are all kind of open questions at this point. I think the bottom line is that the burden for answering these questions is going to fall to EPA to clearly define in its rule these issues, or on the states to clearly demonstrate their compliance or their approaches to these issues in their state equivalency plans. And now, as you all know, clear definition hasn't exactly been the long suit associated with SIP processes in the past, either on EPA or the state's side. And it's important to understand in this case that EPA doesn't have all the answers either. Hence, it's pretty comprehensive listening sessions that it has just finished up. So that might suggest that we would see even greater deference to states than is typically the case. So states may need to cowboy up here and establish credible, defensible reductions of their own preferred approaches, and hand those to EPA for evaluation. To illustrate how fragile this situation might be thought, 111D, of course, is the section under which EPA plans to regulate greenhouse gas reductions from existing plants. In my view, efficiency will be the key to 111D's environmental and economic impacts, and those two things, of course, will derive its political effectiveness as well. But energy efficiency's only route in, or likely route in, is through state equivalency plans, how states incorporate efficiency. Their success of those plans will hinge on how well and how effectively efficiency is quantified. In turn, quantifying efficiency to the extent that EPA has provided any guidance to date largely hinges on its work associated with the energy efficiency and renewable energy roadmap. And that, in turn, hinges on both the measures and the quality of data that are associated with energy efficiency measures, how well the EM&V has been conducted for those measures, how well that has been translated, the energy savings associated with those measures have been translated into emission reductions, to what degree the EPA regional offices have been involved or aboard those developments, because remember, it's the regional offices, not headquarters, that approves SIPs and presumably will be called on to approve state equivalency plans as well. And then it always helps to have a few success stories to go by. That whole bottom row is none of those elements, perhaps apart from the first one, is very concrete and stable at this point. So the whole structure is a bit wobbly. So the question is, what should states do now? My suggestion is that states work hard to get your ducks in a row, get a handle on your state's current situation with respect to where you'd like to head on 111D and efficiency generally, and then start developing the credible and transparent processes, ideally with pretty broad stakeholder participation and with data where you have it, that can form your state's foundation for defensible greenhouse gas reduction claims. For example, what kinds of efficiency programs do you have in place, or renewable programs? What do you have for combined heat and power? What programs exist in terms of existing EGUs or other supply-side reduction options? What review processes do you have associated with any of those? How are you measuring energy savings, C-Action or DOE's Uniform Methods approach or other? How are those EM&V'd and translated into reductions? Any idea where those emission reductions are located? And then EPA uses EIA information in their projections and compliance defaults. So it'd be wise also to perhaps look into what EIA has for your state's baseline. Equally importantly, it's critical that air offices and commissions and state energy offices be talking with each other and planning together. Ideally also initiating dialogues with EPA regional offices, perhaps digging into the energy efficiency renewable energy roadmap to see how EPA's quantification approaches to date have been taken, or likewise contemplating joining the Ozone Advance or PM Advance programs, which are largely inventorying and identifying efficiency and renewable energy measures, so very akin to the roadmap as well. So in terms of 111 conclusions, I think the uncertainty that stands at this point suggests that the state's best course would be to get ready, get going, and talk to EPA. 111D, as we've noted, is likely to fall largely to the states. So getting ahead of the curve will allow states a better understanding of the problems and challenges that it's apt to face in some of these issues associated with 111D. I continue to be convinced that earnest first movers will be rewarded, that EPA will make a way for those actions to count, and certainly states have and should continue to make their wishes known to EPA. A good example was a white paper that Kentucky recently sent to the administrator suggesting that a mass-based flexible approach be used. EPA's listening sessions officially have concluded, but it's still certainly taking comment and ideas. They're particularly interested, I think, in good hard data and innovative, thoughtful approaches, more so than the later stage of what this party or that party wants to see happen. We'll have plenty of time for advocacy once the proposal is in. Those are my thoughts, and be pleased to turn it back to you, John, or others to shepherd questions.
Great. Thanks, Ken. It looks like we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions, and then I want to leave a couple of minutes to see if Dave and Ken have any closing thoughts. I'm just going to remind everyone that if you do have a question, there's a GoToWebinar panel next to your main screen that has a chat box in it, and you can type your question into the chat box, and the organizers will see that, and we will forward your questions to the panelists. So the first question that I have here says, this is for Ken. Ken, you said that carbon pricing might provide a means of quantifying emissions reductions. How would that work, and wouldn't it still require the same information that the other means would, in other words, some kind of measurement of the emissions themselves?
I think that's quite right, John. The logical or likely scenario that I would anticipate in the case of a state that wanted to implement a pricing option, say a carbon tax or whatever, would be that it would build the case through identifying the policy parameters that it would intend or would implement, and through modeling and perhaps other significant analyses, calculate what sort of reductions, what kind of pricing mechanism is likely to produce, substantiate that for EPA and seek its approval under 111D of a state equivalency plan that incorporated that approach to meeting the emission guideline that EPA had finalized.
Okay. I've got two questions here on a similar topic, and I think these are for Dave. Dave, you mentioned 50 applications for compliance extension with the MATS rule. One of the questions was who received those applications, and the related question is it possible to get a list of those applications?
Did you say, is it possible to get a look at those applications?
A list.
A list. Those are great questions. So the report that I cited to was put together by the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, NACA. They did a survey and put out a short report in June. And they indicate that there were 51 requests, 48 of which had been granted, and that none had been refused. They went to 41 agencies in 31 states. DC, Puerto Rico responded. I'm sorry, in 31 states, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico responded. And according to the responses, there were 51 extension requests. And these are going to state air offices. And the report also issued that there were a handful, 3 or 4 that were forthcoming. So that report is about 6 months old. I would encourage anybody who's interested to contact NACA and find out, they can get a copy of that report and find out some more information and find out whether or not that survey has been updated, because it's been over 6 months since that information came out.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave. And again, NACA, folks, is the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. I think they're pretty easy to find using Google. The next question, and I'm going to have to apologize, Ken, I'm not sure I'm interpreting this question correctly, but I believe the question has to do with the slide that is currently on the screen and the bullet about earnest first movers likely to be rewarded. Does that refer to states that are first movers or generators that take a proactive approach? And if I have misinterpreted the question, I would encourage Mukandi to send a new question.
Well, I'm pleased that you asked that one, John, because I actually intended to add some clarity to that earlier and missed it. I think with respect to 111D, the burden for submitting a state equivalency plan resides naturally with the state. And so I'm thinking that this comment applies to states reasonably directly. And the obvious examples are the RGGI states and California with its AB 32. But as I noted, other states have implemented other policies like efficiency portfolio standards and renewable portfolio standards that I think can be translated into greenhouse gas emission reductions. Now, really that begs the question, though, because how are states going to compile state equivalency plans? Well, one of the more logical ways, they can do it however they want, I believe, but one of the more logical ways would be that they would disaggregate their obligations into what can be done and what has been done within the state. And that's where individual generators would play a key role. I am hopeful that states would recognize and reward earnest first mover generators just as I believe they will be rewarded or recognized by EPA. That suggests to the generators and other non-states on the call that you be active with your state agency in conveying and simply initiating a dialogue excuse me, with them about how that issue is apt to play in that state's development of its state equivalency plan. Very good, very important question.
Thanks. The next question is for Dave. Dave, it sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds on the regulations that you described, some of them more than others. Ken kind of offered suggestions about what state officials can do faced with the uncertainty of 111D. Do you have any suggestions for what they could do in light of the uncertainty with those other rules?
You know, that's really well put, and I think that's that part of the message that we've been trying to get across here is that this is a perfect example of where energy regulators are all of a sudden having to up their game and to improve their knowledge of how these other regulations will affect them. The 316B rule looks like it's not going to, it originally was expected to require closed cycle cooling, which was considered to be especially expensive. And so one group of stakeholders didn't like that idea, and others thought that it would be much more protective of the environment, and they argue that reliability would be better served, especially in drought affected areas. The effluent limitations guidelines are also, and that cooling water regulation is going to be finalized shortly. Effluent limitation guidelines also are going to be finalized shortly. The takeaway that we have as far as whether or not we're talking about water regulations or solid waste regulations or these air regulations is to go to sister agencies and rely and help and get help from them and rely on their expertise to engage with the utilities. If you're in a restructured area, engage with your ISOs. RTOs have subgroups that work on environmental issues. Engage with those, and if it's a commissioner wondering how they can how they can improve their understanding and get rid of some of this uncertainty. I think, you know, it's a matter of taking some staff time and directing it towards these folks and learning more about these rules. I think NARUC has done a really great job at focusing on these issues. They established a subcommittee that is looking at these pending regulations. They've done a nice job regularly educating their membership on these issues. There's no problem whatsoever in getting the folks who present on those during those webinars and getting them on the phone and asking them to, if they would present to your commission, if they would take some time and explain the issues, and if they'd be willing to come back in 3 months, 4 months, and give updates. Developing a relationship with these folks, I think, would be helpful. So as far as specific insider information on any of these specific regulations, I don't have that, but I think it's it's really important. You see that example of Kentucky developing a study and a proposal for an equivalency plan under 111D. I have no idea exactly how far that particular plan is going to go. But it is eminently clear that the state of Kentucky is in the discussion, they're at the table, and that as activities go forward, they're going to be much more aware and informed as to issues that specific issues that will affect them. And I think that's a good model for states to apply in the case of these other rules. I would add one last point here. With respect to the effluent limitation guidelines and what in the recent information that's come out from EPA with respect to toxic pollutants and their interest in coordinating with the CCR rule, it looks like EPA has been able to develop a fairly extensive record that would justify pursuing CCR regulation under subtitle D. In other words, treating it like solid waste and not subjecting it to the more stringent oversight that would be associated under subtitle C with hazardous waste. If that were to be the case, that would allow there currently is an exemption. It's called the Bevel exemption, and that allows companies to use some of this waste for construction material, and it allows for a beneficial use of this material. So as far as any inkling as to how that rule is going forward, today it looks more like EPA is going to go under subtitle D with respect to CCRs than subtitle C. Apart from that, I would encourage states to do just what we have had to do, which is get on the phone, call up people who are in the know, talk with your state regulators, talk with EPA. They're open for business, and every time I've called EPA folks, they're more than helpful. It's been really it's a worthwhile effort. So educate yourself as best you can. Sorry to run on with that, but I think that's probably the bottom line.
And John, if I might just add a contribution to that thought as well, and perhaps even one of the reasons for the webinar today, David started with the changing terrain that faces public utility regulators today, including changing industry and having to deal with comprehensive environmental requirements. I would just suggest that one might be less well served by trying to handicap each of these regulations as opposed to endeavoring through some sort of process that works for your individual firms to apply a gestalt of all of them and try to identify, rather than a path through that resembles a slalom skier, what would be the best single path down the hill that would allow compliance for all of the above. You may find, of course, in trying to handicap individual rules that you did really well with 3 out of 4, but that 4th one is just intractable, in which case you would have spent all the time and effort on the first 3 largely for naught. So I would try to think holistically to the extent that you can.
Great, thanks Ken, thanks Dave. Unfortunately, we've got a couple of questions that we won't have time to get through this hour. I want to assure the people that asked those questions that someone will be getting back to you offline, and your questions will be answered. But I think we've got just a minute or two to see if Dave and Ken have any closing thoughts that they want to share before we sign off.
Thank you, John. Partly what I just tried to articulate is I think the observation that I'd like to make. I think it's at RAP we want regulators to avoid an outcome where they see no choice but to approve proposals to recover costs associated with compliance technology without appreciating some of the alternatives that a utility might have considered in making its compliance decisions originally. And in order to do that, as I just mentioned, you need to coordinate with air, water, solid waste offices in your states, with EPA in DC and in the regions. Explore these issues with your utility companies. Every state utility commission certainly has the authority to have a generic meeting where they explore these issues in open forums, and they gain better understanding. So explore these with your utility companies, with where relevant, your generators, your RTOs. Ask what choices are out there when you talk with these folks and when you look at the regulations, and make sure the utility companies are considering these choices. Those would be my observation. Ken?
Mine would be quite consistent, Dave, and relate most closely to my last intervention, I think, where I suggested thinking of these as a whole. I do think, with respect especially to 111D, that given how new this ground is for EPA, that it's apt to operate reasonably conservatively, so it provides states and companies, I think, with a lot of options going forward. I would certainly suggest you have the dialogues that David just mentioned proactively, as opposed to simply thinking that something might not work and discounting it on that basis. By way of closing, let me also just note that the PowerPoint that will be posted for you does include additional resources and information, both on the individual issues that David covered and several with respect to the issues associated with the carbon pollution standard as well. So feel free to absorb those references, and as John indicated, we'd be pleased to try to respond to questions that unfortunately we're not able to get to today. Thank you very much.
Well, with that, I think we'll say goodbye to everybody, and thank you all for sticking with us for this hour. Hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to follow up with any questions you may have for us, and we'd be happy to talk with you. Thank you. Bye now.